Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, and none came in. And the Lord said to Joshua,
See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and the mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all you men of war. You shall go all around the city once. This you shall do 6 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. It shall come to pass, when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, that all the people shall shout with a great shout. Then the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, every man straight before him.
Then Joshua the son of Nun called the priests and said to them,
Take up the Ark of the Covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Ark of the Lord.
And he said to the people,
Proceed, and march around the city, and let him who is armed advance before the Ark of the Lord.
So it was, when Joshua had spoken to the people, that the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord advanced and blew the trumpets, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord followed them. The armed men went before the priests, who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard came after the ark, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. Now Joshua had commanded the people,
You shall not shout, or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth, until the day I say to you, Shout. Then you shall shout.
So he had the ark of the Lord circle the city, going around it once. Then they came into the camp and lodged in the camp. And Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. Then 7 priests, bearing 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord, went on continually and blew with the trumpets. And the armed men went before them. But the rear guard came after the ark of the Lord, while the priests continued blowing the trumpets. And the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. So they did 6 days. But it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened, when the priests blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people,
Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, she and all who are with her in the house, because she hid the messengers that we sent. And you, by all means, abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed when you take of the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it. But all the silver and gold, and vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord. They shall come into the treasury of the Lord.
So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets. And it happened, when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with great shout, that the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. Joshua had said to the 2 men who had spied out the country,
"Go into the harlot's house, and from there bring out the woman and all that she has, as you swore to her."
And the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all that she had. So they brought out all her relatives and left them outside the camp of Israel. But they burned the city and all that was in it with fire. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. And Joshua spared Rahab the harlot, her father's household, and all that she had. So she dwells in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. Then Joshua charged them at that time,
"Cursed be the man before the Lord, who rises up and builds this city Jericho. He shall lay its foundation with his firstborn, and with his youngest he shall set up its gates."
So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout all the country.
Have a seat. Very, very familiar story this morning. One we've read in children's Bibles since we were young. They've crossed the river and they now face the garrison city. But if we just go back to chapter 5 a little bit, you don't need to turn to it. Joshua goes off to reconnoitre the city. And it says this at the end of chapter 5. When Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No, but I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I've come." And Joshua fell at his face, on his face to the earth and worshipped him and said, "What does my Lord say to his servant?" And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place you're standing on holy ground." And Joshua did so. So Joshua, before we get to our bit of the story, has met with the commander of the Lord's army. God's plan when faced was basically about worship. It all starts with worship. Joshua is called to fall down on his face and worship the Lord. It's a way of Joshua showing that he's not over self-reliant. He's gone out to reconnoitre, which is a perfectly safe and a correct thing to do, but he's realised that the victory is going to be given to him by God and God alone. And it's the same for us in life. Every minor victory that we have in life is a gift from God, and we should respond to it with worship. Maybe it's the victory over temper. Maybe it's the victory over that love and attachment you have to money or the things of this world. God gives us the victory, but it entails us worshipping him before that happens. It entails us putting him at the centre of our life. And so he's given instructions in the book, in the passage we have in front of us, about how they're going to take Jericho. And it's not going to be done the normal way. One of the first recorded military engagements like this in history is the Battle of Megiddo, which was a month long. It lasted for months. It was a siege. It was a standoff. It was in the 15th century BC, and it involved an Egyptian pharaoh, Thutmose III. He led his army into Palestine to quell a rebellion, and there was a battle where infantrymen and chariots were involved in fighting. But then it settled down into a very, very long siege. Lasted for months. It was brutal. There was starvation, disease, and eventually the leaders of the town sent out their daughters and sons to plead for peace. That was the way you normally did things. And Joshua was aware that they didn't have really the kit or the manpower to lay siege to probably one of the most powerful cities in the Near East. But then God tells him, "No, Joshua, you're going to walk around the city once a day for 6 days, and the walls will collapse." That's what it tells us. So Joshua goes into his tent, and you can just imagine the scene, can't you? He gets his commanders of his army together, and he says to them, what we're going to do is we're going to walk around the city once a day for 6 days blowing a trumpet. And then on the 7th day, we're going to walk around 7 times and blow the trumpets, and we're going to shout. And God's going to give us the victory. And you can imagine them getting the straitjacket ready, can't you? Joshua, this is not how you fight a battle. But it's interesting, one of the words I heard Malcolm saying a lot was 7. 7's a really important number in the Bible. God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th. 7th was a day of completion, of rest, of God's plan being fulfilled. We're led to labour for 6 days, and on the 7th day God gives us rest. 7th also appears at the crucifixion, number 7. Jesus spoke 7 statements in agony on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Truly I say to you, today you'll be with me in paradise. Woman, behold your son. All statements, God spoke through Jesus 7 times on the cross. It was the perfection and completion of God's mission on earth. And when we're told how we should pray 7 times. It's a sign of and a symbol of God's perfect plan. And so Joshua would have got that. Joshua would have understood that. And I also want you to know that the Ark of the Covenant, God is leading the way. This isn't Joshua taking his men out to battle. This is God leading the way. He's already led the way across the Jordan. And similarly, God is with us when we face what appears to be an impossible challenge. I don't know what your impossible challenge might be, but when we face an impossible challenge, we worship, we come to God, we ask him for his help and his instruction, we do as we're told, and we let God take the lead. You can imagine the soldiers standing on the walls of Jericho, can't you? Seeing this little bunch of Israelites marching around their city. They're all armed to the teeth, and they would have just been laughing themselves. They would have wet themselves at this. What do they think they're doing, this group of Israelites? They're trusting God. That's what they're doing. So 7 times, 7 days, for 6 days, they walk around the city blowing their trumpets. And then on the 7th day, they blow it 7 times. And the Lord gives them the city. But the problem I have with this story when I read it is the bit that goes on towards the end of the passage, where it talks about Rahab the prostitute being the one they save, but the rest being destroyed. It's in verse 18. Keep away from the devoted things so you will not bring about your own destruction by taking them. It won't make the camp liable to destruction. And then it goes on to say in the rest of the reading that they go into the city and they destroy everything, the old and the young. Sounds terrible, doesn't it? Sounds against all the rules of war. It sounds against everything that we think is right. Only Rahab and those who are with her survive. Let's make this simple. When God's judgment falls on a sinner, it doesn't fall gently. God created everything and ultimately can decide what happens to it. It offends us because we're not God. But God created every life in Jericho and therefore has the right to decide what happens to it. And when God's judgment fell on Jericho, it didn't fall on those who had received his grace. And therefore anybody in Jericho who'd received God's grace needn't have faced the wrath of God. The people of Jericho could have followed Rahab. They'd all heard what had happened in crossing the Red Sea and all the rest of it. They didn't need to respond as they did. They were sinners. And they were not saved by grace because they rejected God. In Leviticus 18, we read the following. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived. You shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You will follow my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes. If you read the opening verses of 18, we see what the people of Canaan were up to. They were involved in incest, various forms of sexuality that were not approved, bestiality, child sacrifice. God's wrath falling, as we read it in this passage in Joshua 6, was the last thing God wanted to do, but he had no option because the people had refused to obey the call of God. They'd refused to do what God called them to do. Because in chapter 9 we read that Joshua made peace with the Gibeonites and made a covenant with them to let them live, and the leaders of the congregation swore to them. At the end of 3 days they had made a covenant with them, and they heard they were neighbours and they lived among them. So where the people of the foreign land make peace with God's people and follow and acknowledge God's work, there can be peace. But the people of Jericho were not prepared to do that. The Canaanites of Jericho brought judgment upon themselves. This is not an act of a vicious God who's acting without any rhyme or reason. This is a group of people who've been offered the chance to turn again and again and again and have rejected it. There's a game which my kids have played, which you may not have come across. It's called blockheads. And you stack irregularly shaped blocks and you make an increasingly unstable tower. Like those blocks, the sins of the Canaanites were being stacked up until at one point the tower becomes unstable and collapses. We must not make God's patience we mustn't read God's patience as indifference. We have to remember that God calls his people to forgiveness, to repentance. So what's the passage about? The passage is simply about the people of God keeping an eye on what God is doing, listening hard to where God is leading and following and doing it. No matter how crazy it sounds, doing it God's way is always the perfect way to do it. And they're not to take anything from the city. They're not to taint themselves with the things of this world. They're to put those in the treasury. And they are to destroy at God's instruction that which has rejected God's generous mercy and grace. We need a bit of New Testament help to understand how this applies to us. So 2 Corinthians 10. For though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war with the flesh. For the weapons of warfare are not the flesh, but the divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments with lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. We take every thought captive to obey Christ. We're not fighting in the way we understand fighting at the moment. We are involved in a spiritual battle, and therefore we need God's help. In Ephesians 6, finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armour of God, and you'll be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers and authorities, against the cosmic powers and present darkness. Therefore, take up the whole armour of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. We don't need to think how we face the world in our terms and with our plots and plans. We need to put on the full armour of God, because we're fighting an enemy who will use underhand methods. The focus of this passage, if you want one simple big idea, is holy living. If you want the big idea of Joshua 6, it's holy living. Worship, listening to God, doing as God tells us to, staying separate from the things of this world, and making sure we are always living for God. You see, what Satan wants is for churches particularly to start doing things the world's way. We're using worldly thinking to make ourselves acceptable. So there are many people who say we shouldn't be teaching sin because we should be making the church nice and welcoming and loving and cuddly. That's buying into the world's understanding. That's selling the gospel short, marginalising grace. Grace is a glorious message. The other way that the devil wants us to grow the church is through human management systems. How do we manage the church? This is a diocesan issue. How do we manage clergy and churches in a management way that will allow for growth? We don't. We do it God's way. We see God's will for our churches and grow them. And the last thing Satan wants us doing is praying. I wrote a pastoral letter this week about prayer. The last thing Satan wants us to do is stay in touch with HQ. He wants us to be acting independently on our own. So what must we do if we want to see our churches grow? We must search out and listen for God and then adopt the plan that God has laid out as our battle plan. That's the key thing. It's not about what I think, it's about what God thinks. We must accept Christ as our senior officer, as our general, and we must believe and trust in him. I suspect all those people in that tent when Joshua laid out his plan went, this is bonkers. But they still trusted God, and they marched around that city, and they blew their trumpets, and they shouted their act of worship. We must believe and trust that God, yes, does have a plan for Cossington, Seagrave and Sileby, and that it's a perfect plan, and we must meticulously obey the rules with great attention to detail. We must acknowledge that God is sovereign. God knew the outcome. He told Joshua repeatedly in the passage that he was going to give him the city. God will give us the people he will give us if we trust him. And don't second guess God. You'll never be able to do that. Because God can do more than you can imagine, more than you can possibly dream. God will give you the most wonderful gifts if we just do as we're told and obey him, seek his face, faithful in worship, and trust him. That's the story of Jericho, the strongest city in the Near East, given into the hands of a bunch of travelling nomads with very little in terms of military power. God does it because they do as they're told, follow God, seek his face, and live for him. Amen. Let's take